Yesterday's prophecies, today's headlines. This is the Hal Lindsey Report. And now, Hal Lindsey.
Good evening and welcome to this edition of the Hal Lindsey Report. In 2009, when President Barack Obama accepted the Nobel Peace Prize, the world saw him as a man of peace. I'm sure he saw himself the same way. Peacemaker is a title worthy of aspiring to. Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." Barack Obama wanted history to remember him exactly that way. But presidents don't get to choose the times in which they govern. Today, Mr. Obama is leading the United States into another war in Iraq. But his reticence toward war still remains. America's friends and foes alike see that reticence as a lack of commitment. That's not an impression you want to make when trying to lead a coalition of nations into war. His reluctance shows itself in several ways. For instance, he's been unable to articulate a vision of what will constitute victory. We need to create a plan and stick to it. We need a vision. As Proverbs says, where there is no vision, the people perish. We have to identify the enemy, decide what we're doing and why, and then do it with all expediency and get out. There's no such thing as a no-muss, no-fuss war. We should never enter war unless it's absolutely necessary. But if we do conclude it's absolutely necessary, we need to do it with absolute commitment and give our military all the assets necessary to win quickly. As General Douglas MacArthur said, in war, there is no substitute for victory. If we approach war without a careful and well-planned use of all our military assets to bring the war to a swift and victorious conclusion, it will be prolonged and result in needless thousands of casualties and suffering on both sides. In World War II, we fought and won a global conflict in less than 6 years because the United States and its allies were all totally committed to use every asset at our disposal to do so. We have not totally won a war since. As a result, we have still not resolved the Korean conflict in the 64 years and counting. When politicians jumped in and started viewing our wars as police actions, and when we allowed politicians to enter wars with half-hearted commitments and no plan to win, wars began to end in unresolved conflicts and multiplied thousands of unnecessary casualties. Some have been saying that the ISIS situation is not at all that urgent, that we can go slowly and use minimal effort. They say ISIS is bad, but no real threat to the U.S. homeland. This assessment borders on criminal ignorance or willful deception. Senator Dianne Feinstein chairs the Senate Intelligence Committee. In an op-ed for USA Today, she wrote, "The threat ISIS poses cannot be overstated." She called the Islamic State the most vicious, well-funded, and militant terrorist organization we have ever seen. In the absence of U.S. leadership and action, we could suffer the consequences for decades to come. Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel has said of ISIS, "This is a threat to our country. This is a force that is sophisticated. It's dynamic, it's strong, it's organized, it's well-financed, it's competent. And it is a threat to our allies all over the Middle East. It's a threat to Europe. It's a threat to every stabilized country on earth, and it's a threat to us." Representative Mike Pompeo recently called the Islamic State an existential threat to America. That seems like an overstatement until you remember what just 19 jihadis did on September 11th, 2001. They not only killed 3,000 Americans, they stole freedoms from all Americans. They corrupted our daily lives. Our economy is still hurting from their action. And they did what all terrorists try to do. They made us afraid. On the same day President Obama announced he was taking us back into another war in Iraq, the New York Times ran a story that said, American intelligence agencies have concluded that ISIS poses no immediate threat to the United States. No immediate threat? Which intelligence agencies were they talking about? Back in June, NBC News reported ISIS poses an extremely high terror threat to U.S. targets and has the bomb-making skills and foreign fighters needed to strike U.S. and other Western interests, according to multiple U.S. intelligence officials. Apparently, these two notoriously liberal news organizations have been talking to different intelligence officials. That's not surprising. The U.S. government hardly speaks with one voice these days. Ramzi Mardini is a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Rafik Hariri Center for the Middle East. In a column for the Washington Post, he wrote, "The Islamic State's fundamentals are weak, and it does not have a sustainable end game. In short, we're giving it too much credit." You know, even a few months ago, he might have had a point. At that time, ISIS survived by conquest. If their expansion had been stopped during that phase, they would have imploded. But their conquests have now given them, if not stability, at least a level of wealth unknown to any terror organization before them. Black market oil sales garner them over $3 million a day in revenue. They sell their oil for a third of the usual cost, and certain countries and companies can't resist a bargain like that, no matter whom they're helping. The Islamic State has taken over banks. It levies harsh taxes on conquered peoples. Its wealth runs into the billions of dollars, and its total revenue from oil taxes and contributions exceeds $6 million a day. And their expenses remain low. After all, they didn't buy their U.S. military gear. They took it from the fleeing Iraqi forces. Then last week, the U.S. Congress unwittingly sent them a new round of arms shipments by agreeing to fund the president's plan to arm the so-called moderate Muslim rebels in Syria. They might as well have called it the ISIS Weapon and Relief Act. Those who claim that the Islamic State is not an immediate threat usually say that the U.S. is far away and ISIS is preoccupied with winning its regional conflicts with Syria and Iraq. But that assessment ignores the Islamic State's challenges. To defeat the governments of Iraq and Syria, they need to grow bigger and richer still. They need to bolster their recruiting efforts, and they would like to have more contributions. They think the way to do that is to make themselves out to be the most fearsome terror group in the world. Remember, they're marketing themselves to the worst people on earth. They attract recruits and contributors by sending out gruesome death images over social media. They show off their cruelty and violence. But their big score comes when they seem to be slapping down what many Muslims see as Islam's greatest enemy, the United States of America. We know their marketing strategy because we've seen it. We know it includes trying to hurt and humiliate America because that's what they've been doing in their death videos. That's why so much of their intercepted communications this last few weeks have been about ways to strike a terrible blow against the United States. The chatter on social media shows that they have friends everywhere. They talk about how easy it is to breach our southern borders and smuggle weapons into the U.S. They urge their people who are already here to use social media and public records to find the physical addresses of the U.S. service members and their families. Then they tell them to go to those homes and murder service families. Intelligence services use the word chatter. There was a lot of chatter in the summer of 2001, and the Bush administration took a lot of heat for not regarding it more seriously. But that summer's chatter was nothing compared to this last summer of 2014. Some say that ISIS is now a state and not a terrorist organization. But that's not accurate, because it's still in the business of terror. It still publicly beheads people. It still crucifies Christians, rapes women, and kills anyone who disagrees with it in ways chosen to cause the most fear possible. That's terrorism. Only a few days ago, Australian authorities arrested 15 people accused of plotting to randomly capture citizens and publicly behead them. They were working in Australia under the direction of a senior leader from the Islamic State. An attack on a major Western power may seem improbable to those with a bean counter mentality. But not long ago, those same people said ISIS would never amount to anything, even in Syria or Iraq. We must understand that to hit the United States in some way is not a meaningless act to them. Hitting the United States is the ultimate goal of all terrorists. Terrorists hate the U.S. with a supernatural passion. Remember, they view us as the great Satan. So the most ruthless, barbaric, and spectacular attacks against us builds them up as a major player in the world, a fighter not afraid to take on the biggest bully on the block and their ideas. But we also need to remember that ISIS is only one threat among many. It has inspired armies of terrorists, cartels, gangs, and even lone wolf assassins determined to act even if they must do it alone. Many of them desperately want to make a name for themselves. And above all, we need to remain vigilant regarding the single greatest threat to peace in the world. That is still the Islamic Republic of Iran, intent on building a nuclear weapons arsenal with which to rule the Middle East and destroy Israel.